Welcome everyone, and welcome to this final session of the Future Scientist. I'm James B. Barbieri, Program Coordinator here at the Power Center, and I will be your host for today. And as a host, I'm here to help you. So any issues, just let me know in the chat. Just very briefly, if you could please mute your microphone to ensure good quality audio. I encourage you all to use the chat to share your thoughts and ideas with ourselves and the rest of the group. And that finally, this session is recorded for you all. So today we have Alex Gómez-Marín holding a recapitulation and a conversation between the audience to summarize this past year together on the Future Scientist. So as we all know, Alex is the director of the Power Center, Spanish physicist turned neuroscientist, and he holds a PhD in theoretical physics and a master in biophysics from the University of Barcelona. Since 2016, he's been the head of behavior organisms laboratory at the Instituto de Neurociencia in Alicante, where he's been an associate professor of the Spanish Research Council. And with that, I'll hand it straight over to you, Alex. Welcome.
Thank you, James, and thank you everyone for coming again today. So today we're gonna do a celebration, kind of. It's a bonus track. We do it for the joy of it, and it's interesting that given how amazing this year was, at least for me, that this happens. Well, we did it on purpose right at the solstice, and as I was driving here to the office, the sun was setting, and so it's also a very significant moment of the year, I believe, and I suppose you believe too. So today I want to invert the structure or the logic of how I've been doing these things, simply in the sense of, well, I don't have an invited guest to talk to. You are the invited guests to talk to. So I'll make a kind of a summary. It's not really a summary, some notes about how the project came to be, what happened, what could have happened, and what happened that I wasn't expecting, briefly, for 30 minutes. And then we'll open it and we'll have an hour. We don't need to use it all, but we have an hour. And that hour is for questions, of course, but maybe answers as well, and feedback, and not even feedback, also advice, critique, suggestions, ideas, right? So in a way, I'm gonna, as I always do, I always take notes. I don't know if you realize, I'm a bit of a Stevie Wonder, because I'm writing like this, you know. And so I'll take notes because I really want to learn from your perspective as to what has happened and how it has been useful and what have you missed and so on. And so let me also remind you, so we'll have an hour, but also if you can use the chat, that's maybe a something I ask you. If you can use the chat to drop there any thought, idea, because I understand not all of you may want to jump in and ask questions or say something. So if we can deliberately use the chat for that, we'll very carefully read all the comments later, and I'm sure they're going to be really useful for future things that are going on. Okay, now before starting, I want to try something. We'll try it at the beginning and at the end. I've called it a zoom in and then a zoom out, because on the last conversation last week with Shantena, something very beautiful happened, which is there was this nice atmosphere, and then we were many, and I put all these windows. I'm going to do it right now because I see myself big here, all these windows. And then we say goodbye, and then people started to leave, but they were leaving slowly, and they were looking at each other. So there was kind of a moment of contemplation, and, you know, like stars, the windows were just disappearing slowly and slowly, and there was a fade away. I don't know if some of you were there, and I felt, what a way to zoom out. So we'll do the zoom out at the very end, and maybe now we can do a zoom in, and the zoom in is going to be for a minute. Just perhaps you're doing this already. Just let's look at each other's faces, and that's it. Let's do that for a minute. Okay. By the way, this can be a kind of practice that we implement on Zooms to make them a bit more human or humane. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll explain to you the original intent of this series, then very briefly go one by one through the 12 speakers we had and summarize not really what happened, but more my feelings as to what I took from that. And then we can talk about what could have happened. And finally, I'll tie this with the next series and my decision to put an end to the future scientist and transform it into the future human, which is going to start on January and very similarly to this, one per month and so on. Okay, so the future scientist, let's go slowly. We could have called it the future of science, but there was some meditation as to the title. And I thought, well, it's important to emphasize the person because science is maybe too abstract and there's science with capital S and these things can be confusing. Also, the idea of science gives the impression that there's just one and only science. There are many kinds of sciences and ways to practice it. So that's why I inverted it and call it the future scientist. That's the title. Again, we can talk more about this later. We have an hour. And then I called it a conversation series. A series is not a sequence. A series is one thing that then builds on the next and builds on the next. So the intention there was kind of a snowball effect, something that kind of sediments. And then the next installment is maybe like this movement, this mantric movement that builds upon it. And I hope some of that was achieved. That's the word series. And the word conversation for me was perhaps the key, sorry, because I didn't want to do interviews. And by the way, that's the first time I've done this ever. I mean, I talk to people like you do, and I do Zoom sometimes, but being in conversation with people live on Zoom, I hadn't done it before. And my hope was that maybe if done right, which means vulnerability and willing to really explore ideas and avoid the press play mode that we all have, because we all know something that when the other person says it, you want to just sneak it in and so on. If we can do that, but on top of it, something else in this dialogue or conversation, a third element would appear. That sounds a bit strange, but perhaps some of you grasp what I'm trying to say. Like that, there's a third that can emerge when two people are talking. And some of the best conversations I've had, sorry, happen when this happens. So that's my intention, but of course, not always I achieve that because often I was making maybe too many questions or it turned into question and answer, but I never pretended to be an interviewer. I don't like being an interviewer. It was really a conversation. And then we can discuss later if a dialogue is different than a conversation. I like the word conversation because it's like a verse and the other side of the verse. So maybe like a turning back and forth. Another kind of small secret that was useful was the accidental decision to grow the series slowly. So it grew like an organism. I didn't decide the 12 speakers before starting. I discussed the idea with Shantena and with Eleanor. They were very supportive. Then we crafted kind of the spirit of it. And I found 3 people to begin. And we started it. And we didn't know if it would stop, how long it would take, if people would be interested. And that was a good thing because it allowed me to slowly sense how we were walking and then pick the next person with a few months in advance. And I had this feeling that the project grew organically, like a developing embryo. So I also wanted to share that with you. Of course, there are critiques that one can do to that. For instance, the fact that it was hard, I must admit, to bring more women. And later in the conversation, you can blame me for that and we can discuss what's at stake, right? And also it allowed me, the positive thing is to realize, okay, maybe too many scientists here. Maybe we want to bring a historian. Maybe it's time to bring a philosopher. So to do it slowly like this was a good thing. Another thing that happened that I wasn't expecting, it's that very often I see familiar faces. And the second, the third, the fourth time, I could realize there was a community out there. And although maybe I never talked to you, or maybe I did by replying to some of your comments, and that was more clear towards the end, the last 2 or 3 last installments, it felt like a community at the other side. And that's something not to take for granted. Another remark is that I called it the Future Scientist, but the series was not exclusively for scientists nor by scientists. The nor by scientists you can already realize, because as I said, we brought a historian, a philosopher, an activist, and so on. But it's not for scientists either. I brought the Future Scientist as a problem that concerned me, meaning, well, I'm a scientist, I sense things are not going well, I don't want to get into pessimist mode, but I want to think this problem through and realize where science is going, where it might end up going. And I'm still not sure whether scientists will survive the encounter of the direction we're taking. And so that was kind of that was really the spirit of the conversation. Could we think those thoughts aloud in a group with another person, and then really, can we explore that in real time? There was no pretending in this. It's not like I know these things and let's just educate people. No. It was let's figure these things out. And so there's a sense of naivete there, and maybe innocence. And then a final comment before I go through the list of what happened, speakers and so on, is that, well, technology can be a burden and a blessing. And in that case, Zoom is doing a lot for us. And that just explored during the pandemic. So it's another example of how really horrible things can bring with them some powerful light that we can use wisely. I think what Zoom allows is incredible. We take it for granted, at least sometimes I do. But, you know, we still do in-person events in Paris, and they're very important because another thing happens when you're in a place, not in a space, like a virtual space. But the possibilities that a virtual space opens is that people may be easier to accept the invitation. We may do it live. We may then review it, watch it later. So that's been fantastic. Okay, so I'm not sure you've all listened to all of them, and you don't have to. The reminder is that they are, except for one conversation, they're all on YouTube. So if you go to the Paris Center YouTube channel, you can find them all there to listen to them whenever you want. And so we had the first one with Ian McGilchrist. Let me just mention the names. The second one with Rupert Sheldrake. The third one with Michelle Bidbol. Fourth with Vandana Shiva. The fifth with John Horgan. Then Jimena Canales. Then Peter Sosted-Hughes. In August, Avi Loeb. September was Tim Ingold. October was Stephen Jenkinson. November, Jordi Pijem. And in December, we closed with Shantena Sabatini. Some of these guests I knew, others I didn't. And I also used this platform to get to know them. So in a way, perhaps I had a brief Zoom with them, but that was the first time we were really chatting about things. In fact, for instance, I remember when I had this kind of touch base Zoom with John Horgan, and we started talking and we had to stop ourselves. Like, okay, we better stop here because it feels like we're already doing that conversation. And we want it to be like, you know, when you go to the snow, to the mountain, we don't want the snow to have a lot of footprints there, right? So let's leave it there. And hopefully we can be more spontaneous. Now, let me also remind you, and I won't read it, that on the website of the Future Scientist at the Paris Center, there's a rather long, maybe 2 pages description that I wrote a year ago that kind of articulates the rationale. Why are we in need for this series? And well, perhaps it's interesting for you if you don't know, if you haven't, just to read that. And again, send us feedback if you want. And the bottom line in the end was that it was my feeling that science as a whole is perhaps becoming less scientific. And so what can we do about it? And also, written in the page already a year ago, there was something that said that the consequences for humanity writ large, not just for scientists themselves, are pressing. So there was a sense that this is, again, not just to talk about science as we could talk about another human endeavor, that this has consequences for humans, and perhaps that the seed was there already for the future human. Okay. Again, as format, I didn't want to have formal presentations. It was thinking aloud, thinking critically, hopefully, lively, spontaneous. And again, that's not always possible because we all have our habits, right? But if I was happy when in an hour of conversation, maybe there were 2 or 3 moments where I felt that I learned something truly new, or that something really unexpected happened. And I don't know on your side if you sometimes had that feeling. And for that was kind of the little goal that made the rest worth it. The rest was interesting, but interesting is not enough sometimes. Okay, so now I'll go briefly through each of the 12 guests and just share what I think was discussed. Also can serve as an invitation for some of you if you want to go and watch it. And also how I felt about it, about the person, right? Not just the topic. Okay, I started with Ian McGilchrist. And that was the first time ever I did that thing. And I'm always a little bit nervous before starting, but not so much. But I was quite tense. And perhaps that wasn't my best performance. But I'm so grateful to Ian because he was generous in accepting to do this with me, not really knowing very well who I was or what I wanted to do. And so I think there are lots of important nuggets in that conversation. Also, because we were beginning the topic and I had like this arrow so much in there, like, the future scientist is such a hyper object and it has all these many faces. I was a bit anxious to just say how many faces it had. And so that may have transpired. A consequence of that conversation I had with Ian in January is that then we started this series covering the chapters of his book, The Matter with Things. So how nice a branch of that initiative that since then we've recorded them all. We've recorded the entire book. It's behind right there. It's 2 tomes. We've recorded the 28 chapters plus the epilogue. I recorded the epilogue a couple of weeks ago in London and we met for the first time. So lucky me, I asked this very prominent scholar to kick it off. He accepts. We do more. I get into his work deeply and I would consider him a friend now. So that was not bad to begin with Ian McGilchrist. Second, we had Rupert Sheldrake, and I've been in conversation with Rupert for some time. So he was, of course, a kind of scientific hero, and now he's a colleague, a mentor, and also a friend. And there we started touching on the themes of dogmatism, heresy, and also not just the negative side of it, but Rupert brings in a very positive spirit, which is, we can discuss all these sociological and political issues, the politics of knowledge of science, orthodox, heterodox, and heretic science, but he also emphasizes promising breakthroughs. So he's very creative with ideas, new experiments that could be done, also outside academia, in a kind of democratized do-it-yourself science. So that was also very, very important, not to be possessed by this negative tone of just complain or rant, but say, we could do things in this different way. Then the third installment was with Michel Bitbol, whom I had met like many years ago, once in Paris. And I wanted to bring him to explain to us, or really, I'm selfish here, to me, like, let's see if again, I can understand what phenomenology is. And phenomenology in the philosophical sense, not just the study of phenomena, but this attempt to articulate the primacy of felt experience. And that talk was was amazing. Look, it's the talk that has, and I don't count this, don't think I'm so narcissistic, but it's the talk that has less views. And in my opinion, it's one of the most profound talks we had of the whole series. And he, if you remember him, he had this smile of joyful enlightenment, you know, calm and clever and loving. And he, in my view, explicated phenomenology in a way that I hadn't heard him or anyone before. And this allowed us to place human consciousness at the center of the future science, perhaps. That's how I see it. Okay, the fourth installment was Vandana Shiva, right? And when you say that name, wow, that's power, that's courage, that's intelligence, that's sustained work, you see. I was also blessed she accepted. By the way, often when somebody comes to Paris for the first time, and we are in the what's the name of the room, you know, the meeting room before starting, it turns out that there are many connections, like with Bohm or with Italy or with David Peat. That kind of, well, I'm not sure if it's a synchronicity, but that happens often. So I brought Vandana in because we can talk about epistemology in science, new experiments in science, but if we forget the political implications and the societal responsibilities, then we're a bit naive again, because science is made by humans in the world, and there are all these forces, right? And Vandana has been detecting, articulating, and counterbalancing those forces. And so she offered really, I think, a wider picture of what the relationship between human beings and the earth, and human beings with other human beings could be. And so this is real world activism. So there's real skin in the game. Scientific experiments bring skin in the game, but this is another level of skin in the game. And of course, she also emphasized the feminine and Mother Nature, which was maybe an implicit theme throughout the conversations we had this year. Okay, fifth, John Horgan. So we brought a philosopher, as I just said, a scientist, an activist. I wanted to have a journalist, because how do profane people hear about science? Well, maybe in Christmas, if you have some family member who's a scientist, but you hear it through the media, right? And well, this is quite problematic. So I brought John because he's a very prominent scientific writer, and he's written tons of pieces. He's very curious. He's really engaged, very generous, and also very honest. And I remember while discussing with him, and we were talking about consciousness and the limits of knowledge and so on, that he was even about to change his mind about certain things. And this kind of like changing one's mind is seen as a sign of weakness among scientific alpha males. And here I am talking with somebody so, you know, not knowledgeable perhaps in depth because he's not a scientist, but really about what is going on. And he was kind of confessing that he believed that, and then he believed this, and maybe now he's changing his mind. So again, I wasn't anticipating that. That wasn't in the program. But again, that was a gift for that conversation, that openness, very remarkable. All right. Number 6, Jimena Canales. If we don't study a bit of the history of our country, of our discipline, we know nothing, really nothing. And when I was studying physics, we had one subject, history of physics, towards the end, and it wasn't compulsory. You know, it's like, well, a hobby. In a way, like most of the things we're discussing here, not in the curricula of scientists writ large. No epistemology, no sociology, no politics, no history. And so, if you remember Jimena, she has written a few books, and one in particular that spurred a revival of the understanding of what happened 100 years ago when Bergson and Einstein met in Paris. And, you know, Jimena, she's precise, she's very precise, very careful, and very detailed in her explications of history, but also offering this high vision. And I recall from that conversation how clearly and eloquently she said that
there's this confusion, and tracing it for whence it comes, that we now, most of us, or most people, tend to conflate what is real with what can be measured. And that was like a major kind of chiropractic move in the whole understanding of where we are. And not only making that statement, which could be made by a philosopher, but going back and realizing where this all started. And she talked to us about, of course, measurement, the revolutions in physics at the beginning of the 20th century. Hopefully, this century we're gonna experience something alike, maybe not for quantum mechanics, maybe for consciousness studies, who knows? He brought us back to those sweet historical events. And the most important take home is, together with this conflation of measurement and reality, is the beginning of the divorce between the sciences and the humanities, that in a way, the clash between Bergson and Einstein embody. And the key question that we can take from that lucid conversation, well, in her part, of course, is not so important what time is in that clash between Bergson and Einstein, or even what mind or consciousness is, but what's important, or even more important, is who has the authority to say what it is. So that's, for me, the take-home message of that conversation. We can discuss about what things are, and in a way, probably will never end. But there's something underneath, which is some groups of people, scientists or not, and within science, perhaps physicists and not psychologists, let's say, seem to have an authority to pronounce themselves upon certain themes, and other people seem second class. And that goes again against a kind of pluralism that is perhaps really badly needed. Okay, so number 7 was with Peter Sørstedt Hughes. I wanted to meet Peter, and so that was my excuse to get to know them better. And by the way, that's wonderful, because I get to talk to them before, during, and with some of them after. So there's really this relationship built through this conversation. I was curious about him. He is, if you recall, even in his own appearance, heterodox, but really well-grounded. So he had published this book, Modes of Sentience, and in very few pages, he was covering the nuggets of all these isms: physicalism, panpsychism, materialism, dualism, dual aspect monism. So I read that and it's like, this person is very lucid, and he's not a philosophical trickster, you know, pretending to be clever. He's really going at the core of things. He's enigmatic and transparent at the same time. And so we discussed about psychedelics and how, but in a way, philosophy is also psychedelic because it's mind revealing. And we talked a bit about these social rituals we have. So coffee breaks and beer hours are sanctioned to kind of turn our productivity up or our mingling up. But there are other substances that for some reason are taboo. And we explored a little bit the origin of why these became taboo or stigmatized in the 60s. And we discussed the current psychedelic revival, and probably more to hear about it next year. And we talked about those modes of sentience. And by the way, this led to more thinking and to an event we'll announce soon for next year in person in Paris about the edges of consciousness, about how to study consciousness, but not in the usual kind of rather sterile, I may say, or boring laboratory experiments, but all these edges, a constellation of states, and maybe you don't like the word states, but modes of sentience and phenomena of consciousness that are perhaps like the Luke's backdoors to understand the phenomenon. All right, bear with me. Number 8, Avi Loeb. If you remember, Avi Loeb is an absolute professional of interviewing, right? He's been doing this, I don't know how many, he's had thousands of interviews he had done over the last year, perhaps. I felt like the interview started and there was this wild horse, and I could just grab the tail and hope to get dragged and not lose him, right? Vibrant, quick, so much to say. And he's at the top. He's, if I recall, at Harvard, right? head of the astronomy department, if I am not correct, at Harvard. But, and this is the interesting but, based on that interstellar object called Oumuamua that was detected passing very close to Earth, he and his team started to propose that given the measurements of properties of that thing, that it didn't look like a natural object, or if it was a natural object never seen before. And if it was an artificial object, it didn't look like a human-made artificial object. So, here we have this main figure in mainstream science who all of a sudden is claiming that the evidence suggests that perhaps that thing that came close was some sort of extraterrestrial technological debris, you know, like some broken machine that just came by the way from outside the solar system and just crossed it. And that led to the usual reactions, the taboos, and again, once more, now not in physics, not in consciousness or in neuroscience, but in this case in cosmology, we see how cosmological matters cannot be dissociated from sociological ones. And this opened the question of what unknowns are we allowed to study and what unknowns aren't we allowed and why. And it was very funny in a way, and also a good counteracting to Carl Sagan's main mantra: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That Avi Loeb says, well, extraordinary evidence requires extraordinary funding. So here we have the extraordinary evidence. Rather than kick us to the side and say, no, we continue doing normal science, just give us funding and let's figure this out. And so he's also been reading many essays, and at the end, he was defending the creative, authentic, and generous individuals that, from his point of view, and also from mine, are being selected out of academia. And that was coming again from somebody who's high ranks in the food chain. Okay. Number 9. What a pleasure to have Tim Ingold. What a deep man, deep anthropology, an anthropology that touches cybernetics, that touches philosophy, that touches human nature writ large and its relationship with the other organisms on Earth and Earth itself. And we discussed his recent book where he is trying to, and perhaps not just trying, but accomplishing to heal this bifurcation between what's imagined and what's real, this dichotomy that what's imagined perhaps it's not real. He wants to put it back together. The caveat, and that's a subtle one, was that he wants to make that, but without reopening the gap between humanity and nature. So he has had this long trajectory with all his books and essays where he, as I understand, it's like you can trace good real research in real time. Like you can see his ideas, he's addressing this problem. With this essay, he's addressing this other problem. This is coherent. He has a point. Now he moves on. And in this book, he says, well, I need to come back to that problem of this bifurcation, but I don't want to fall back in the traps I thought I had solved. And that's immediately apparent if you read the preface, if I recall correctly, of his book. And so again, what an honesty, what an intellectual honesty and profundity of thought. And we discuss creation, attention, and correspondence, and subtle, and again, not show off, but really subtle and nuanced differences between multi, inter, and transdisciplinarity, and back to the love of learning. Yes, a wonderful conversation, and again, a luxury to be able to have somebody like him in the series. Now we move to number 10, and this was Stephen Jenkinson. And I've Zoomed with Stephen, like many of these impressive people. I've never met them in person, most of them. I had Zoomed with Stephen maybe 4 or 5 times. That was the conversation I was the most scared about. Because, as I call him, Stephen is a poet of non-negotiable truths. And he's a Canadian who speaks English, but he uses grammar and vocabulary in a way that you could call that another language. That's not English, that's something else. And at least I constantly feel he's whispering the unspeakable. He's saying something very clearly, but you can never grasp it. And well, I didn't know how that would go. And apparently after our conversation, he felt it went not just well, but perhaps quite well. And we talked a bit about what he's known for. He's known as the grief walker because he's been, as he calls it, in the trade, in the death trade, counseling, perhaps is the right word. People who are going to die, but they refuse to die. And he has been able to articulate this insistence on avoiding the pervasive absurdity of current cultural imperatives to die, not dying. And as he says, we're all interested in that topic because we're all gonna die, right? So it's not a topic. And he criticized, as he says, the pernicious triad of cope, hope, and dope. So it's not very politically correct, again, right, to say those things. And when it comes to science, we were discussing how science is the agent, the culprit, and the victim of the restless impulse to globalize everything. And that's a point I want to emphasize. And perhaps science is too Catholic. Perhaps science has inflated so much that, you know, and I'm not even talking about scientism, which is its more pathological manifestation, but even healthy science. I mean, I'm a physicist. We're trained for 4 years. These are the secrets of the universe. And these equations are going to work no matter where, no matter for who, no matter when. But then Stephen Jenkinson is questioning whether knowledge is actually indigenous. It's from a place and a time and a context, right? So I think this is a profound philosophical, but also cultural allegation, as he would say. And by the way, stay tuned because we have a good surprise for an event with Stephen next year. So this is a little bit of an announcement. You see, if we can fish those beautiful fish again and now bring them to Paris, we strive to do it. Okay, number 11 was Jordi Pigem, who's a Catalan philosopher. I'm also from Catalonia. And at some point I felt, growing organically the series, well, yes, people from, not from everywhere, unfortunately, but what about my own country? And I discovered this man. He's a true independent scholar. And he's been in these scientific/philosophical reflections from really early on. He has many books, and he has books also on Bohm and Sheldrake. So all these names that we often hear in Paris. And he had written one about the pandemic and about post-truth and about techno-capitalism and the Orwellian as the new normal. But he had done it in a very nuanced and sharp and also brave way. I think the book is going to be translated in English. It is in Catalan and in Spanish. And so we talked about the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution and about science, but also about science with respect to education and with respect to health and with respect to the economy. And again, stay tuned because he'll be another lovely fish that will come to our alchemical vessel next year. And finally, last but not least, I really wanted to close the series with Shantena Sabadini, the former director of the Paris Center, and a man who, in my view, has a unprecedented integration of heart and mind. And you could see that if you attended our last conversation. He's funny, he's deep, he's joyful, he's relaxed, he's intelligent, he's knowledgeable. And so I took the opportunity to learn something about the I Ching. Sorry, he said not the I Ching, the I Ching, and talk about divination versus prediction. Use that opportunity to reflect on other ways of being in the world that may be so alien to the Western mind. And this also us to talk about all the many features that resist scientific rationalization, like this idea that there's meaningful randomness, right? This idea that you're not predicting the future, but in the moment you're providing this meaning that even if you that was funny again, even if you run the itching badly, it still can work. And well, and that talk, by the way, touched on, I think, very deep abstract concepts, but also it was deeply personal with the very concrete. So in a way, Shantana was able to embody what he is preaching, if he's preaching anything. Maybe he's not preaching anything. And so that's how we ended. And so I could have continued with this. I'll open it soon for comments and questions and so on. I could have continued with this because it's working, it's popular. I get the okay from Eleanor, Steele, and so on. Okay, I'm the director. I can continue doing this, but one thing I learned from Stephen Jenkinson, another thing, is that endings are very important and things must end. So in the same way that I just literally felt like a drop on my head, oh, why don't I do this? Why don't I do this about the future scientists in December last year? Through the summer, I felt, well, maybe I should put an end to this. And there was no reason. It's not like it's not going well. So yes, I'll put an end. Yes, we'll try to integrate. But then there was also this thing that something new wanted to grow out of it, which was the future, which is the future human. And that's what we're going to do. So, of course, the future scientist as a topic, it's not finished, not covered. There's so much that remain unsaid and implicate. And maybe we said some incorrect things and some wrong things. This is still work in progress. And perhaps, and I say perhaps because I don't know how in the world I'm going to pull out the time to do that, but I like to write those distillations of those conversations and maybe expansions in a book called The Future Scientist. We'll see. But for now, next month, we're going to start with the future human. And once you start thinking about the future human, well, that's more than ambitious, because you can talk about the future of food, the future of cities, the future of birth, the future of words, the future of the future of the past, and so on. And so I hope this grows organically, but maybe a bit rhizomatically. And we already have quite a few confirmed guests, but we're going to be revealing them slowly. And that's also why it's important that we have this recapitulation today, because I want to hear what worked for you, what didn't work, what you would expect. And I think we can incorporate this into the future human. So finally, this is a moment for me to express really my gratitude to the Paris Center, to James, to Eleanor, to Maureen, to all the rest, because 1 year ago, I had just given an online seminar, a random online seminar. Okay, this guy is interesting. We'll talk about, what was that? The Consciousness of Neuroscience was the title. 1 year later, I mean, I cannot believe I have this resonance with this place and these people, and I'm now part of them. And we're together thinking about continuing what has been done and perhaps adding some beautiful new ideas. So it's really amazing, and it's been a blessing, a true blessing. And what a way to just say that, and that concluding the Future Scientist series and doing it on the 21st of December. So with this, I'm all yours for anything you want to say. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Alex, for this review of the Future Scientists that we've had together in the past year. And of course, I mean, there was always one constant throughout these sessions, which was yourself. I mean, throughout this year, we've managed to get to know you, get to know your ideas, and you've got so many, and you're very vibrant, energetic, always trying to get to the bottom of things, but not only under one discipline, but through all of them, if you are able to. And you always try, which is greatly appreciated. And yes, I mean, and this is why, we had this sort of change of direction here at the Paris Center after Shantana decided to step down. You were definitely the right person. And throughout this year, this is what we found out, that you really were the right person at the right time. So thank you for this series and for being part of the Paris Center family. So with that, we do want to hear from all of you. We've got about 45 minutes to hear your thoughts about the Future Scientist. As usual, if you want to make a contribution or make a comment, you can use the raise your hand function on Zoom under reactions, or just write in the chat and I can read it out for you if you're more comfortable. To start off, I'd like to invite Catherine. Hi, Catherine, how are you?
Yes.
Now.
I'm all right. In Uganda, we have 30 degrees now, you know. I'm so happy to be here. Sorry that I've been registering for these talks, but not saying anything, really. You know, because my father taught me that in order to lead, you must have humility. And in humility, ingrained in humility is your right to dignity. So my comments are almost three. One comment, I would like to read an excerpt from a book we wrote in South Africa. David Pitt and Shantena were my fellows in the chair I held in South Africa. And it was a chair that was funded by the parliament through the Ministry of Science and Technology. I'm not a scientist, though I'm a member of the Academy of Science in South Africa and a fellow of the African Academy of Sciences. But it was a chair that was created as an intervention in the South African higher education systems. And so we wrote a book called Rethinking Thinking, Modernity's Other, and the Transformation of the University. And I'd like to read to you a couple of sentences from that. It says, our planet is like a taproot. It draws its life from diversity. The taproot cannot survive without recognizing the subsidiary rootlets, which from its spring give its life and energy. We in the mainstream have taken the algebraic geometry of modernity as a given, shaped our lives on the formulas that we have acquired from education, read schools, that are modeled on one paradigm only, the Western one, and forgotten the non-modern rhizomes that are the conditions of its possibilities. We need to rethink thinking itself and critically examine the current default drives of the knowledge production, paying particular attention to the deep exclusionary practices inherent in the disciplines like science, law, economics, and education itself. So I would like to, I wanted to say this before otherwise men or women give their comments, because, you know, I may disappear or something like that, but, you know, I wanted you to hear from me that I take science, economics, law to be almost the disciplines of death, because they have shut out the rest of the that modernity needs or science needs to seek justification of itself universally. Thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing this, for calling attention to this book that I didn't know, and that's helpful to think about the future human. And perhaps maybe I can ask you, perhaps what a strong statement, right? The disciplines of death, but perhaps science, economy, and law, it's how they're practiced by scientists, economists, and lawyers, right? Because I would suppose that they're,
yes,
in the word, in the etymology of the words, it's something full of light, right? Economos and sire, to know. So that's in a way where we together are trying to recover that luminous aspect of it, but then the dark aspect is in all of us at the same time. And definitely there are treasures in the West, as I always, you know, claim my own indigenous knowledge of the West, but we need to make, and that sounds like a politician, but really efforts to grasp what other traditions have to say, and maybe not to integrate them, because that can end up being a colonizing attitude, right? Okay, so now I get them, now I put them in my bag of knowledge. As I was saying, maybe indigenous traditions are indigenous traditions. So I'm honored that you started making the comments for this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. I don't know if you can see, but we've got Eleanor and Jenna here who wanted to say hi. We remember your visit here in Pori very warmly. Thank you, Catherine.
thank you.
Next, let's go to Aaron.
Am I audible?
Yes.
You can hear me, right? Okay. Well, first of all, I should say that yesterday I was totally unable to do anything with Zoom, because I have been trying to change my computer from one operating system to another, because Firefox, at least for the other operating system, stopped supporting Zoom. And this is my first attempt to find out whether the switch has worked. And so I'm very pleased that it has, just in time for me to, I was a few minutes late. But anyway, I think I may be hallucinating, and if so, I won't be upset. But I feel there are deep connections between the sorts of things you've been talking about at a meta level and things that I've been thinking about for half a century, switching first from a degree in maths and physics, and then gradually moving into mathematics, and then discovering philosophy and mathematics and Immanuel Kant and various things, and then switching into philosophy, and then trying to understand how ancient mathematical reasoning worked, and it didn't seem to be covered by anything that I heard neuroscientists and psychologists saying. It didn't fit my personal experience as a student of making discoveries in geometry, for example, or topology. And then I started learning about artificial intelligence, and spent a year in a major AI center in Edinburgh, and had my brain rewired and thought, oh, well, this is the way forward. We can combine AI with all these other disciplines. And I actually wrote a book in 1978, The Computer Revolution in Philosophy, in which I claimed that people within about 10 or 15 years would be regarded as uneducated if they didn't know about all this. 50 years later, it's still not, the claim has not been justified. Anyway, what I'm now going to say is what happened to me about 2 years ago. I was at a conference, a Zoom conference, and people were talking about problems about reasoning and discovery and how brains work and so on. And suddenly it struck me that what happens in eggs of chickens and ducks and alligators and many other species was totally inconsistent with things they were saying about how knowledge about the world had to come from being exposed to the world and training neural nets or whatever by collecting data, finding statistical regularities and so on. That is refuted by the fact that I expect everyone attending here already knows, but hasn't thought about, and maybe some of you have, in which case we should collaborate. The fact that there are many species of animal that come out of an egg, and I'm thinking now mainly of vertebrates because insects and their cocoons are also very complex, but that's different. But chickens, alligators, swans, tortoises, a whole lot of those things, kinds of snakes, they come out of their eggs as a result of a process which starts with mostly a small nucleus, a fertilized cell, and a huge amount of goo of several different types. And somehow that fertilized cell starts reorganizing itself, and then it creates machinery that reorganizes other parts. And the reorganization goes through many stages, and it's enormously intricate. All those blood vessels and nerve fibers and bones and tendons and muscles and whatever outer covering there is, and the digestive system having to be constructed, and the breathing system and all the other things. And they're all assembled inside that egg in parallel with a kind of intricacy of control that is, I think, unmatched by any human engineered assembly mechanism. There's nothing remotely like it on the planet that humans have produced. And of course, it has taken millions of years for evolution to produce these kinds of things. But what I'm now suggesting is that if we start looking at those biochemical processes and trying to understand how they not only produce chemical changes, but also during the processes of development during hatching. And I think there are things to do with the evolutionary history that mean that those processes change in complexity at different stages of evolution of a duck or a swan or an avocet or a tortoise or whatever it is. So new kinds of assembly control systems have to be assembled inside the egg during the hatching process as it goes through stages of increasing complexity. And there's no room for any such machinery. It can't be spatial structures moving around and assembling things. It's all going to be done by electromagnetic or other relationships. Now, it feels to me that for those reasons, and there's a lot more to be said, but I've said it too much already. It feels to me that this links with what I understood you to be talking about. And if so, I've put a link to a web page in which I've got a lot more detail. I'll put it in the chat thing if anyone wants to follow it up. And the link will have my email address on. But I wonder if you recognize this as relevant. If it's irrelevant to what you're saying, I apologize for the time.
No, it's relevant. Thank you. I'll check I'll check the link for sure of what you're saying. You mentioned mathematics. Look, I had a long list of topics again within the future scientists. Think of them as the faces of this, hyper object, and also a list of people I would have liked to talk to or even discover, because sometimes it's like I sense, well, we should have talked about mathematics too, right? If this had 40 installments and not 12, I would have loved to bring a mathematician. And for instance, one that's on my list, it's Giuseppe Longo in Paris. And it's very important because physics and mathematics are sometimes conflated, but they overlap. Like the mathematicians have offered methods and understanding for physics to run. And sometimes physics runs without mathematics, the hardcore experimental science on materials, for instance. And then there's this other overlap, which is biology, which I don't think it's a province of physics. And maybe biology needs its own mathematics. And maybe the mind sciences need their own mathematics yet to be invented. So mathematics is a very important, again, topic. It sounds like a small word. And you also mentioned developmental biology. And, you know, there's a bias here because I brought neuroscience because I'm a neuroscientist and because there's this revival of interest in the mind. We had cosmology. I could have brought genetics. But developmental biology brings us to the mystery of form in time. And this is as deep as it gets. And it's related to mathematics, I would say, because mathematics, people tend to think that mathematics is about numbers or, you know, what they learn in school. But no, it's about forms and structures too. So I see
topology and geometry.
Sure, exactly. Yeah. So I see a connection between you're saying the maths and the developmental biology. And also thank you for mentioning evolution, which is a big, big, big theme, especially for the future human, right? Is there going to be human evolution? What does that mean? And evolution is another kind of transformation in time. Maybe homologous, maybe not, to development in some respect. So all these three are major hyper objects in this space we're exploring together. Yes, thank you.
It links up closely with the symbiogenesis theory of my dementia's got me again. I've forgotten her name. You're nodding. You know the woman I'm talking about. Yes. Right. Well, thank you for your response.
Well, and please share your link and information. Thank you in the chat if you wish.
Right.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Aaron, for coming in. Next, I'd like to invite, let's invite Michael.
Hi, thank you so much. For me, this has been an amazing series. And some of us in some dialogue groups have spoken to it, and it had the feel of a fireside chat.
Sorry?
And it had the feeling of a fireside chat, the way you interacted. And it was really beautiful to hear you talking about how you were learning along with us. So in some ways, as someone who's taught, you're modeling learning for us, which is really, it's unusual and beautiful at the same time. I was fascinated with the Yamena Canales and the embracing novelty with Bergson versus kind of like that block idea, which, so this is really great. And the format I thought was phenomenal because it was almost like an invitation into a group and not just being taught at, like sage on a stage type thing. And I feel like that helped open it to everyone, especially myself. But one of the reasons why I popped my hand up, it's really interesting listening to Catherine and Aaron about kind of this idea of the algebraizing of modern science, because Newton had a quote in Universal Arithmetic that the value of geometry was that it didn't involve numbers or calculation originally. So he had a very different view of geometry than what we thought of. And this led me down the rabbit hole, like did a book on classical geometry with just constructions. But in English, and I don't know about Italian, but in Greek, there's this delineation between techne and physis, nature and what is built. And I feel like we're more and more enclosed in structures that are built like bricks. And we tend to impose that view on nature. But like Aaron was speaking of, nature herself, what is it? Individuates within itself on its own, yet it's complete at every step. It's not like, oop, got to wait for that cell to come over so we can, finish. It may not be finished, but it's always revealing itself through its change in form. So, I just wanted to share that in case anyone's going down the rabbit hole. But it's like it does seem like there was a different mindset dealing with holes and wholeness in geometry, and then dividing within that wholeness, rather than thinking of things being assembled. There's uses for both. And from a classical standpoint, geometry appears to have been focused on working with holes and then dividing. Which way do you get to the number 2? You can either add or you can divide. So, but no, the series is amazing. And oh, that was the last thing. When I first saw you questioning the question with the consciousness studies, that was wonderful. That flavor of questioning the question, that was the last thing. With who's Chalmers? Not in this series, but in the other one where it's like, okay, Chalmers has already boxed it in by the form of his question.
Yes.
So yeah, that's all.
Well, thank you again, Michael, because I see you every month, and you always bring loving and intelligent comments at the same time. What you said about modeling learning for us, it's perhaps the best praise I could hear. Because, as you know, the Paris Center used to be called the Paris Center for New Learning.
Yes.
That's perhaps one way to explain what it is that we're doing there. We're exploring these new ways of learning, and well, we're trying. And we're learning.
No,
we're learning about these new ways of learning.
It rings very true to my heart, especially with the background in movement and martial arts. Because the idea of a master in martial arts is they're the eternal beginner. So they're the ones who are always questioning and curious. It's not that they've accumulated or amassed all this knowledge. They are perpetually learning in the moment.
Then it's homework for me to get into these algebra versus geometry, maybe versus topology. So maybe from whatever people can post in the chat, I'll dive into it. It sounds juicy.
Yeah, I can send you a bunch of stuff if you're interested.
And with respect to nature and build, I don't know if maybe that could be a koan, right? Is the electron, as I've mentioned before, or a number 3, are they invented or discovered? Perhaps the answer is both.
Yes, right.
So that's another thing to meditate. And it has to do with our relationship with reality, by the way, which is much of what I've covered with Ian on his book, this encounter with reality. Is it out there? Not really. Is it made up? Not really. So what is it? Okay, it requires a new way of conceiving relationships so that you escape that binomial trap. Yes. And finally, questioning the question, I genuinely do it. It's not to show off. I think questioning the question it sounds like, well, that's what philosophers do, but we scientists, we also need to do that. Otherwise, we just continue forever in a straight line, and we don't know, maybe we get nowhere. So there's a big, you can save a lot of time, energy, if you question your question, rather than put 99.9% of your money, energy, technology, and attention into rushing for an answer.
You've already cast the form by the form of the question itself.
Yes. All right.
Yeah.
Well, it's great to see you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Michael, for your contribution. And next, let's bring in Niels.
Okay. Thank you. I've learned so much in these Paris sessions, and I feel I've got something I can contribute, which for me, having looked at everything that's going on, and seeing what is happening in biology, the complexity of things. So my sense is that unless we can debunk complexity, we are going to be lost forever. That's where I come from.
Unless we can what? What's the verb?
Debunk complexity.
Debunk.
Yeah. In the sense that complexity, we can define a paradigm where complexity doesn't exist. That is my entry into it. I'm not one of those those computer freaks who make wild exclamations of this and that. This is something that's happened over 50 years. I have been in computation. And what has come to me in all that, in order to achieve anything realistic, we have to consider the whole. As soon as we break things up and look at a small part only, we can't discern from a small part how that fit into the bigger part. Whereas if we have the bigger part, we can understand all the small parts. And I think this is to me, that this is the crisis in science, basically. And I can contribute something there because I've been through all these stages in transportation modeling, if you like, and simulation. And that it's to do with flow of bits and interaction, like we have people moving, pedestrian moving and interacting with one another. And in this work, what has been really interesting is that it's kind of, the way we interact is kind of subconscious. It's like we are dancing a ballet. So if we meet people coming towards us, if you're just changing your little direction just slightly, then you can see how other people change their direction. It just takes one to start that process. And so in all of that, and there is one particular algorithm that will do all of that, and I want to teach that, but for 30 years I've been trying to do that, and it takes attention, but it relates to what they call non-duality, if you like. So it's and I just found a book by Smuts, the South African. He was Prime Minister of South Africa at one time, and he wrote a book called Holism and Evolution. And he kind of theorized where we should be going, because he's saying that is the way nature operates. Nature operates in this debunked state of complexity.
Thank you, Niels.
Well, maybe a way I can just offer, as you're offering thoughts, I'll offer maybe a way to, well, I'm still not sure what debunk really means here, but that's my negative association with this verb. But maybe organicism is complexity upgraded, and organic philosophy,
it is, yes,
process thought, which brings us to flow, which you just mentioned. And thank you for your dance metaphor, because it is embodied, it is dynamic, it is relational, and it's also artistic. Yes. So yes, this sounds right to me. Yeah, thank you, Niels. Sounds right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Niels, for coming in. I'd just like to invite someone who we haven't heard much from this year. Let's invite Ron.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I missed so many. I was here for the last one on Sabatini. Anyway, I do my best to make this as brief as possible. So I wrote my question down. If you don't mind, I'll read it. So the question is, what if we've got it backwards? And mind, body, the universe arise out of consciousness rather than consciousness being just one of so many elements that are part of the universe. And the question goes on to ask, can this hypothesis that I just spoke of really be taken seriously? And if it could be taken seriously, would it not be a Copernican sort of paradigm shift for understanding the future human? So that's my question.
It's an easy one. Thank you. Thank you, Ron. Well, I'll confess, I've done it before. For some reason, I'm not convinced about the word paradigm shift, because I constantly hear the paradigm shift is near, like the transhumanist with the singularity. It is near, but it's never really here. And maybe that rhymes even, you know? And we're all striving for this new paradigm, and it feels it's right here, but in a way, it's not really making it. So maybe that's some pessimistic reflection. What we've got backwards, well, a charitable view, and I'm not at all attempting to respond to that question. Maybe we can come to this question really, Ron, in 12 months, when we do a recap on the future human, which we probably do. It cannot be answered now and maybe then either, but perhaps the charitable vision is a series of accidents and dead ends, maybe with good intentions, like even Cartesian dualism. Maybe it was a good solution for certain problems. Then we got stuck with it. There is this habit, we forget. And now when we want to apply it to other realms, we don't know how to reverse that dead end. And maybe because of hubris, we say we just continue forward. And then it gets more complicated and it gets worse. And so perhaps it's this inability to just stop and realize where we are and correct it. Sounds simple, but in a way, and this is another thought I'll share, maybe history has a meaning, and I'm not saying it's written, but maybe this is all an adventure, right? And within this adventure, there are these episodes of nonsense and even evil, right? This would lead us to a very theological discussion, but perhaps it's an adventure. It's God, and I think I discussed this with Ian in the last chapter. It's still not out. The last chapter of his book, The Sense of the Sacred, chapter 28. This idea that if God has all these qualities, God cannot be named, but it has all these qualities, omni, and fill in the blank. And what is it missing? It's missing limitation. So here we go, limitation for God. And now, and when I say God, again, it's not like the bearded man on the cloud and so on. So perhaps we got things backwards, but it was part of the whole beautiful tale of the cosmos, playing that game on itself. I'll leave it here. Thank you for that question, Ron. It is the question, perhaps.
Thank you, Ron, for your question. Let's go. Next in line is Todd.
Well, thank you to Alex. Appreciation for the series, but also for your energy and synergy that you're bringing to the Party Center. It's delightful to hear how this series has sort of evolved organically, and your choice of the word conversation. I mean, conversation may be harder to define, but I think we all know when we see or witness the absence of it. I just happen to have a house guest here that fills the air with words, leaving no space between them for exchange or otherwise. And so one is very conscious of the fact that it's not a conversation. And so this dance of exchange of information, I'm a little saddened to hear it's the end of the series, but delighted to hear what the next one is. But thank you again for what you bring to it and what you are continuing to do. The promise is wonderful. So thank you from myself, all those folks in the Pari Center, and all the folks that get to listen whenever they do, whether recording or not. So we'll see you next year. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Todd. And as you know, together, you and I have had some indelible moments of this very process. So it's really great to see you and to talk to you. And yes, conversation.
Maybe it has to do with conversion. And I know there are allergic reactions, conversion, religion. No, we're spiritual here at best, but not religious. But for me, converse has an aspect of, or a possibility of, maybe a promise of conversion. Thank you, Todd.
Thank you, Todd, for coming in. Next, let's go to Peter.
Yeah, hi. I just want to make a recommendation for the Future Human series. He may be on your list already, but it's Brian Swim from the Human Energy Project.
It's not? No, tell me about it, please.
Oh, right. Well, he's a cosmologist, and he's really, together with Thomas Berry, who was his mentor, pioneered the new cosmology, or the universe story, the new story of the universe, and its significance in this whole aspect of the change, the necessary change in mindset, that would even bring consideration to finding new language, or bringing new meaning to the very word human. But it's in particular the value for the consideration of a question like the future human put into a cosmological context of inquiry.
Yes, yes.
So it's Brian Swim, SWIMME. He's just brought a new book out, which is called Cosmogenesis.
All right. Yeah. I'll take note, definitely. Thank you. And it reminds me of Raymond Panikkar, who we mentioned when we discussed with Jordi Pijem before the event with Xantena, installment number 11. And Pijem, the Catalan philosopher, had studied one of the great thinkers we have in Catalonia, Raymond Panikkar. And he has a book. Well, he has many books. He also gave a gift of lectures on the rhythm of being, and he has this book, The Cosmotheantric. And so he there integrates the anthropos, right, human, the cosmos, and the divine part. So seeking for a proper triangulation, right? So maybe there's some connection with what you're suggesting for me to take a look and study, and I will. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Next, let's go to Ji-Yun.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for everyone who is in the family of the PARI Foundation. I've grown so much just knowing you exist. I think my fundamental question is one of the mother, and in particular Jude Caravan's recent book Gaia, which talks about the big breath. And I watched on this Gaia channel, this person, Stefano, I can't pronounce his last name, forgive me. Anyway, there's this concept of sixth dimensional causal geometry that then translates through fifth dimensional unity consciousness or wholeness, possibly in the way that Krishnamurti and David Bohm might have had some insight around it, which is contiguous to the Buddhist mandala, Sri Yantri geometries, resonant frequency vibrations. And then what they're doing at ASU with Stephen Phillips. And Stephen Phillips has written a book on my thesis. I thought there was a link between biophysics and then biochemistry, and then chemistry, and then earth sciences as nested growth of forms through things like phi and theta and more circular consciousness. So that goes back to Hestia, the ancient Greek goddess who symbolizes the circle and the hearth. And when we think about the hearth, it has the word earth and heart, and to hear through our ears as an organism that is listening for. And so as I listen in memory of David Bohm and David Pete, what I remember is the book they wrote together on creativity. And I thought that the mother is the intimate embodiment of co-creation of life. When I gave birth, I had a samadhi experience, an enlightenment experience, and I gave up my dream job, literally the most dream job, to be with this creature who made me see someone who was insecure and scared and ugly as with compassion and luminous. So then the second child came, and others said he was like the Panchen Lama. So I just wonder where we might look at biomorphic birthing processes and relationships as inseparable wholeness of an already made nature, or as phenomena onto which we can stop projecting partial, fragmented, fractured realities and truths, but really sort of pause, silence into that which we already know indigenously, and then just remember as the source of our imagination, or reimagining the wholeness as balance and harmonizing, and that we each and all have the skills and tools already. It's just our awakening to that possible awareness. And some people do it through psychedelics or through, like Chris Bache or something, but there is a metastructure and a superstructure that exists. We're getting to remember it when we get out of our own scientific, empirical, reasoned, dichotomous. Even Descartes got his original ideas through dreams, and Einstein's dreams too. So what is that dream landscape all about? I would be curious. And I think Jung has helped us to really identify that as clearly as anybody. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I've been captivated by your intervention. There's so much in it. What a tour. I must admit, I don't know about most of what you said, but I felt you may be talking about a kind of sacred science, or an integration of science, art, and the sacred. And your emphasis on the mother I think will help me vertebrate the future human, because perhaps that's that mother. And I think the word matter, materialism, with two T's, matter, has to do with mother. So what comes to mind is that there's this return home, and the mother is also home. There's this return home, which is a re-spiritualization of matter. Perhaps that's the trip, that's the journey. So it's in this return, seems to be what you're so beautifully articulated. And wow, and thank you for bringing forth also the giving birth. Yes.
Yeah, I want to just add, the sperm is really powerful. It's so potent. We don't recognize that the arrow that gets fired is the first arrow, and it splits the circle, makes a heart and two spiral vortices, which is the anu. So the heart is pumping, right? Both ways, masculine, feminine. I don't want anyone who's, Jung said within the man penis body, there is the feminine, and within the feminine, there is the, masculine. So it's not a either or. Just because you were never carrying the child to term doesn't mean you don't have that capacity. It's just an invitation to inquire about the wholeness, to include mother again, to come home again to ourselves, our whole self, not separated from science, religion, and art, but that they are already whole and one. We just forgot in our scientific empirical paradigm of the past 300 years, but it's sitting there as the container.
Yeah.
The circle is the container of all the geometry, essentially.
Mm.
And it's also within the hexagon. If you look at the flower of life, it's kindergarten principles of how color, number, shape, sound, all are already resonant frequency vibrations of the same. It's all the same. We just perceive it through our eyes as color, through our ears as sound, through our logic, reasoning as
Yes.
calculations. It's the same. Innumerably, the manifold geometry and symmetry is there in the toroid and the Mobius strip. It's all there. It's already complete. It's just we need to remember it if we can, as to remember ourselves home to Mother, which is progenitor of our species, as a just to balance, Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much. Happy New Year.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Happy New Year.
Well, thank you, Jian, for your contribution. Alex, are you happy to take maybe one more?
Yes, I am happy.
Okay, great. Let's go to Manfred then.
Do you understand me?
I do.
Okay. Alex, you mentioned a new learning. And the question for me is, what could a new learning be? And I think, or what I do not understand is that we do not start from an organism as a whole. We start from a part of it. And at the same time, we say an organism is an undivided whole. Everything is interconnected with everything. So for me, as I see it, it would make sense to turn it around, to start with the unknown or with implicate order or as a whole or whatever you call it. And we cannot see the whole, that's clear. But what we can see or what we can recognize is that whatever we can grasp is a part, and it could never be the whole. I don't know how you think about it.
Yes. I learned this distinction, an obvious one, but non-trivial recently, between parts and fragments. I hope it's not a linguistic trick, but it helps me. So in a hologram, the parts can contain the whole. So it's not like the part is the bad guy and the whole is the good guy. So I think I understand, and it's important. I always say, apropos of entanglement, for instance, but it works for entanglement and it works for a football. That sure, you can split it in two parts. Let's call them fragments. You can, because when we say, well, the whole is more than or is different than the sum of the parts, or when we say, no, you cannot break a whole. Well, you can, but the price, there's always a price, as I understand. And this took me some time to understand. And it's so simple. Sure, you can. You can take a living organism as a biologist and study it by actually killing it and slicing it, right? By the way, inherited from taking atoms and smashing them into each other. So makes sense to open things, right? But often you cannot do that operation without the thing you're studying changing in nature. So perhaps we can deal with parts, but when we deal with fragments, then the whole is gone. And so we're studying another thing. And so if we're mindful of that, well, but what did we want to grasp in the first place? The whole or the sum of, and perhaps it's both. It's a commute. So maybe a way to solve it is we start with whole, we go to parts, and then by some alchemical miracle, we go back to the whole. Otherwise, we will be kind of contemplating beings in ecstasy all day long, right? Or on total bliss. I mean, we need to make things apart. Like when I go back home tonight, I'll cut an onion to make dinner. So, well, part and whole,
let's not treat them as a divorced couple, and one's the good one and the other one is the bad one. And perhaps this distinction between fragment. To me, a fragment is a part that forgot that it belonged to a whole. And maybe that's a nice way to tie it up with home and mother, right? And this return, which maybe is the invitation of the future human, a remembering. And remember is recordar, and recordare is to go again through the heart. So it all makes sense.
Thank you. Yeah, but I think that's it. So to see such a fragment is a fragment. That might be the most important thing, and that you cannot put fragments together because the whole is already here. So that's how I see it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Manfred. Now we have gone a little bit over, and I can see that the questions have been exhausted. So I'd just like to bring it back to you, Alex, just to close this session, but also it is the last session that the Power Center is holding in 2022. So just for you, we'll bring it back to you to see if you have any final words for us.
No. I'll propose a zoom out, which is we look at each other's, unless you have an announcement, and then we'll do the ceremony after that, but we look at each other's faces and we just disappear at our own pace as a kind of ending process, knowing we're all still there. So maybe that's the best way to end this.
Well, just before the zoom out, which we will do for sure, I'd just like to, just say a few words as to finish 2022 together. Just a bit of a recapitulation of what the Power Center has been this year. Well, for the Power Center, it's been a very invigorating and transformational year here at the Power Center. For the first time in almost 3 years, we were able to have in-person events, which were wonderful. We had the Revisioning Consciousness conference chaired by Shantina Sabatini in June. We had the Psyche in Time conference in collaboration with ISAP Zurich, brought together with Andrew Fellows. And of course, we had the Enchanted Universe conference, which was chaired with you, Alex. And with that conference also came a bit of a transformation within our team. First of all, you stepped in as the new director, Alex. We had a bit of a transformation. We've created the advisory board, bringing together members of the community, experts in their fields, in their academic fields. And also my little sister, Chiara, she has sort of joined the team, come on board with helping out with the coordination of events. So our family has expanded very much so. Together with that, of course, we had our 6 major online events where we had the Dualities series, was brought together with from Jenna Axelrod, Maureen Doolan, and Eleanor Pete, where we tried to bring together the black and whites, and we sort of figured out that the gray is in the middle. We've had the Love in the Time of Crisis series, brought together with Eleanor Pete, Gary Goldberg, Beth Macy, and Dave Shrum, where we looked at the power of love in our lives and our work and disciplines. We had the Beyond Bohm series, which sat run for almost 2 months, as it was divided in 2 parts. The first chaired with Lee Nico, and the second with Paavo Pilkkanen, where we looked at Bohm's philosophy, both under his humanities work and physics work. And finally, we had the Recovering the Sacred series, which has just passed, chaired by John Pickering, where we explored the value of the sacred, very much put aside by at least our Western world. And of course, we had the Future Scientist with you, Alex, where we tried to create a picture of what the future scientist or science may look like and how it might work. And so with this, I'd just like to thank all the speakers and advisors who have been with us in this past year, but especially a great thanks to all of you, the audience, as you know, the Power Center creates this space, but it's only as valuable as you are, with your contributions, your comments, and even just you sitting there and listening to us and holding this space. It's been a wonderful year, and we do owe it all to you. So thank you all so much.